President Trump changes his rhetoric and his tone on Ukraine, saying the country now can win its war with Russia and that he will help sell Europe weapons it can use against Vladimir Putin's army in order to win. Does the president mean what he says this time, or is this the start of an attempt to stop trying to mediate the war and maybe just wash his hands of the whole Russia-Ukraine business? You never know with President Trump.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
And that is the subject today of our Potomac Watch. Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot. I'm the editor of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and this is our daily podcast. And I'm here with Kate Batchelder Odell, as well as Jillian Melcher. Now, Jillian's just returned to London from an extended trip to Ukraine, including to the east, where Russia has been gaining territory slowly and painfully against Ukraine for some months. And we'll want to get her view of what's going on there. But let's start with President Trump at the United Nations this week, where he address the issue of Ukraine.
The biggest progress is that the Russian economy is terrible right now. As you know, it's crashing. And that, frankly, Ukraine is doing a very good job of stopping this very large army. It's pretty amazing. You know, this is a war that should have ended in 3 days, 4 days. People said it was going to be very quick, and you got to hand it to the Ukrainian soldiers and everybody involved.
The president startled, I think, a lot of people with that comment. It wasn't too long ago when he told Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president in the Oval Office, that he had no cards. Russia had all the cards. Now he's saying Russia does not, in fact, have all of the cards, that Ukraine has been doing significant damage to the Russian economy. He also said, and I thought this was very interesting, that NATO should, when asked, should shoot down Russian jets that enter NATO nations' territory. And he went on to say, with time, patience, and financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option for Ukraine. He said, Russia's a paper tiger and in big economic trouble. What do you make of all this?
Well, I think most Americans are looking at this statement and wondering what to make of it themselves and saying, you know, I've heard this rhetoric at Putin before, and it ends in the same old nothing. So I do understand that the empirical record here suggests that the president might not be pivoting to putting actual pressure on Putin. But there are a couple things here that do stand out to me as notable. I mean, this was his toughest and clearest statement on the war to date. To bring in Ukraine's original borders as a real possibility is a tacit admission that the outcome in Ukraine matters to the West, and that the U.S. has an interest in ending the war on terms, not just ending it and stopping the bloodshed, but ending it on terms that favor the United States. So that is different. You also had other elements of his administration, like Marco Rubio at the United Nations, echoing these remarks. They look less to be of a one-off than some of his other statements. But look, you know, he has to back it up. If he were really serious about it, I think by now, perhaps we would have seen him call for the sanctions bill that's been languishing in Congress to pass. He could have announced a new weapons variant he'd give to Ukraine. We're still missing that crucial policy behind this welcome and tougher rhetoric.
Those are important questions. Interesting to me was also what the president said. What he had said, he said he thought that the Ukraine war would be relatively easy to negotiate a settlement over because, and this I'm quoting, because of my relationship with Putin, Trump said. But unfortunately, that relationship didn't mean anything, Trump said. So, Jillian, in one sense, for me, that's the beginning of wisdom about the limits of Trumpian personal diplomacy. President Trump, even more than most presidents, seems to believe that the force of personality, the individual relationships he forges, even with bad dudes like Vladimir Putin, adversaries like President Xi Jinping China. Trump has long seemed to think that those relationships would lead to diplomatic and strategic breakthroughs. They really haven't across his two terms so far. But if this is the beginning of wisdom about Putin, so much the better.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think one question that a lot of Europeans I've been speaking to, and Ukrainians as well, has been if Donald Trump realizes that Vladimir Putin has been tapping him along, as he said once, that basically he's getting played. This is also a president that tends to take things personally. And I think there's a lot of curiosity and potential anticipation about what it would mean if Donald Trump realizes that Vladimir Putin has been playing him effectively. But yeah, you're right. This personal diplomacy doesn't work with Putin. I think he has sort of a view of himself in historic terms. He wants restoration of what he views as Russian greatness. There's the rhetoric about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the great tragedy of Putin's era, and that's how he sees things. And so I don't think it was realistic ever that this war was going to be ended based on personal diplomacy. It will end when Vladimir Putin has an incentive to end it and to get to the negotiating table. And I think the good news for Ukraine and the good news for the United States is there's a ton of opportunity that's been untapped to exert leverage on Russia.
All right, we're going to get into that a little bit, but let's listen to Volodymyr Zelensky this week after the president's remarks, saying what he thought about them.
Are you surprised to hear that?
A little bit. A little bit. I mean, this. I'm sure in my people, in my army, and I'm sure in strengthening of in support of the United States. But President Trump was more positive in it, and he showed that he wants to support Ukraine to the very end. So we understand now that we are ready to finish this war as quick as possible. And he wants, and I want, and our people want. But he understands that Putin doesn't want, and he understands that he is not winning, but he says to everybody that he will win. And I see it was a little bit surprise for me.
President Trump met with Zelensky this week as well, and Zelensky's view of that meeting was also positive. Now, not a surprise. Zelensky wants to put the best face possible on potential U.S. support, but it's nonetheless a real change from earlier in this administration. So if you were looking at a lineup of potential pressure points that you would say, okay, Trump is going to really get serious here, I guess you would look at the sanctions bill, Kate, you mentioned, that Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham and the Senate have put together would allow the president to impose tariffs, significant tariffs, up to 500% on countries that buy oil from Russia. There's also the question about Russian overseas assets, some $300 billion, and what the West could do with them. Though Europe and the U.S. have been reluctant to use much more than the interest on those assets. But I saw that Chancellor Friedrich Merz of Germany has said today that he thinks Europe now should do something with those assets and help them help Ukraine with them. But here's the issue with the oil sanctions bill. It's sitting there. President knows about it. One of his main allies, Lindsey Graham in the Senate, has been pushing him on it, but he's been resisting. He doesn't want to pull the trigger on it. He doesn't mind that it's out there, it seems, President Trump, but he doesn't want to actually have Congress pass it. And recently he's turned and said, well, we can go ahead with those sanctions. I'm willing, but Europe has to stop buying oil from Russia, oil and gas from Russia as well. I mean, I'm sympathetic with the president on that point, and I think Europe should cease doing that. And it's kind of amazing that this long into the war it's not. But that can become an excuse for doing nothing.
Certainly. I mean, the president said even that he might call his friend Viktor Orban, since Hungary is one of the prime offenders in this case of relying on Russian oil. I mean, I agree with you. I am sympathetic to the president's point that given Europe has started to understand the existential nature of the threat from Russia, that then follows that they should not be purchasing Russian oil. I think the hold off on the secondary sanctions bill has more to do with China and a reluctance to impose those secondary sanctions on China. I mean, NATO called China a, quote, decisive enabler of Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. They have been pouring in not just raw materials, but weapons components. There is a story out in this morning about perhaps Chinese collaboration on drone technology. There's no question China has been enabling that war. But I think there's been some reluctance out of the administration to put those sanctions on Chinese oil purchases because there's also a countervailing desire to have a summit with Xi Jinping. And that has been one thing that's stalled this larger sanctions bill. But again, I don't think Trump is going to be able to seal off what's going on in Europe and get a better outcome in Asia. I think he's got to focus on the tests that come, and the first one is Ukraine and getting Putin to the table.
I agree with you that China is a big motivation here for Trump. He wants a deal with China. Trump always wants a deal with everybody if he can get it. But he wants an agreement with China, kind of modus vivendi of how to manage relations, trade, for example, but also I think a kind of tacit understanding on several security issues as well. And he wants the pageantry, the appearance of a summit. But this desire for summitry is a temptation that too many presidents fall for, I think. And in the case of Trump and the Putin summit in Alaska some weeks back, I think that has turned out to be a real setback for President Trump because it gave Putin all of this cover, all of this, in a way, it restored him to a position of respect in the international order. And yet Putin seems to have made the judgment since the summit, that, you know what, Trump doesn't really want to do anything at all on Ukraine. So I can escalate in Ukraine with bombings and so on, and he has. And he can escalate in NATO with these drone incursions into Poland and air incursion into Estonia, Jillian. And so I wonder if since you were just in Ukraine, what is the view there about the Trump summit and what Putin has concluded from it?
I think there's a lot of concern about that legitimizing Putin, but I think Ukrainians have been making the case that Putin's ambitions don't stop in Ukraine. And Putin is, in effect, making that point for them when he does things like provocative air incursions into Poland or into Estonia. I think you've seen a lot of these violations. And I think they're kind of hoping that Donald Trump will realize that this effort for personal diplomacy didn't yield the results that were intended. Now, I think Trump has kind of hoped throughout this crisis that he'd be able to, if it didn't go well, say that this was a Biden error, that the war in Ukraine never would have happened if he'd been president. And, that's a counterfactual that's difficult to prove. But now what's happening is happening on his watch. And I think particularly given how high profile the Alaska summit was, if there's not a deal, if there's not a successful war or end to the war in Ukraine that benefits Western interests, it's also his reputation at stake now and his credibility.
Kate, what do you think about what Putin has concluded about Trump?
Look, I think the case for why Trump may have to go in a direction here is because those of us who have argued that Putin is not interested in negotiating, that he is very ideologically motivated, as Jillian described, have been vindicated by events. The direction here of travel is entirely wrong. You have Putin concluding that he can send drones into Poland, that MiGs doing a little buzz of Estonia is something that he can get away with. And to be clear, I mean, so far, what real price has he paid for it? And I think that's dangerous. I mean, NATO has been saying for years, we will defend every inch of NATO, and I think that has to include, these incursions into NATO airspace.
Well, it's particularly dangerous if Putin has in fact concluded, based on his one-on-one discussions with Trump, that Trump really, in his heart of hearts, does not want to get dragged into this conflict in any significant way. And I understand Trump's anxiety about this. He doesn't want to get directly involved in a war with Russia, but Russia may want to test that proposition. And particularly if it feels that in some way it can turn NATO into a paper tiger by testing it with incursions and so on, and seeing if there is in fact any response from NATO. Jillian, I know you have NATO sources. It seems that there is disagreement in the alliance over whether or not to respond militarily to a Russian incursion.
Yeah, it's been really interesting out here as people kind of gauge their response, saying, well, what happens next? What is NATO going to do about this if you continue having aerial incursions? And it was really interesting hearing from European sources and then Ukrainian sources on that. NATO seemed to think that the show of force that it exerted in rallying F-16s, F-35s, shooting down some of those Polish drones was part of the deterrence. And it's talking about an Eastern sentry moving out to the eastern flank. But I think if you're looking at this from a Russian perspective, and as I'm talking to my Ukrainian sources, they're seeing a failure of deterrence. What happened in Poland was large scale. It was the most flagrantly deliberate sort of violation. But there have been a series of incidents where Russian drones have crossed over the border and nothing has happened. And now you look at this drone incursion and they were shot down using really expensive technologies. This was 20 drones. We don't know why all of them weren't shot down yet. But I think the concern is that if Russia were to do something like it's doing in Ukraine with 400 drones or 500 drones or 800 drones, as we saw recently toward the end of this year, an anticipated 1,000 drones, does NATO have what it takes to be able to stop that? And I think that brings you to the question about the importance of deterrence, about what are you going to do about this? Because there are real concerns that NATO doesn't have enough supply to deal with that kind of attack, and that would put some of its vital assets at risk. And so if you don't want to have that fight, you need to deter it. And I think there's real questions about whether NATO's response right now has been a sufficient deterrent.
Kate, regarding Trump's motivation for his change of tone and rhetoric this week, there are competing stories out there. One is that a journal, I think, has reported that was based in part on a new intelligence conclusion that Russia is struggling economically much more than we had thought, which is interesting. Then the White House itself leaked to the press that this change was a negotiating tactic, which the leak struck me as undermining the president, because when you say, well, he really didn't mean it, he's just negotiating, what is Putin going to conclude? Well, I don't need to move because Trump is just trying a tactical step here that doesn't mean much in terms of what the U.S. would actually do in Ukraine. So a lot of mixed signals.
There are a lot of mixed signals, but I think it underscores Trump has surrounded himself with a lot of people who don't necessarily share the president's strategic concept in some ways. I mean, keep in mind, there was a weapons pause to Ukraine earlier this year, and Trump was blindsided by it. It was appears to have been being run by some of his Pentagon. You have in this case, for instance, in recent weeks, I think Trump has been very affected by Melania Trump's raising the profile of kidnapped Ukrainian children. And I think that has factored into the president's thinking about the war. And I mentioned that because I think there is some really hard animus to Ukraine in his periphery, but I don't know that it's fair to say the president really shares it. And so that is why even though I do see the empirical record here, I think there is still a chance that he pivots. And the second reason for that is because he cannot just wash his hands of this. I mean, he would have done that by now if he could have, I think, because he doesn't want to be the president who lost Ukraine. And he is boxed into this reality that he would own a collapse or a bad outcome.
Yeah, I agree that he can't absolve himself of a bad outcome. On the other hand, he might try because he's a specialist in sometimes just stating things that are not true. And in terms of what based on the evidence is not true, and he'll just say, "Hey, the economy's fantastic, golden age, and all that." And sometimes he does that on foreign affairs too. But I guess I'm more skeptical than you are that this is a real change of heart. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong. But I'd like to see more concrete actions, as I know you would too. Jillian, let me just get a little rundown on what you think Russia is gaining here in the East now in Ukraine. I know you had to sit there in your hotel room and head down to the bomb shelter whenever the drones and missiles alert went off. So, it's not easy to be in Ukraine. You don't get a lot of sleep at night. But what about the East? Is Russia gaining steadily there?
Well, so this was really interesting being out there right now. So it's a tough fight for sure. It's particularly tough for Ukraine's infantry. I was hearing a lot about how lethal drone warfare has become. It's just stunningly lethal, and that the battlefield has changed. So people were describing it as a transparent battlefield. There's nothing that happens within that about 25-kilometer kill zone that everybody doesn't know about. However, throughout the region, Ukraine has invested a lot in fortifying the cities along the fortress belt. And Russia has bashed itself against this repeatedly. And every time it does so, it loses men and it loses weapons. And so they're changing their strategy for fighting a little bit. Somebody actually described it as a medieval siege with super modern technology being deployed. And so you're seeing a lot of trying to cut Ukrainian infantry and positions off from supplies. And that's making it really tough for them to get the ammunition they need at the front, for combat medics to evacuate the wounded, to recover those who die on the field. But Ukrainians overall, I was pleasantly surprised by morale. A lot of them were saying, we are short on manpower, we are short on resources, but we are running on will. And we feel pretty good about our ability to hold this crucial fortress belt for several years to come. So I was encouraged to hear that. I mean, I think another indication here is that Russia has said that it wants to acquire the entirety of Donetsk region through negotiations. And a lot of Ukrainians are interpreting that as a concession from Russia, that this is going to be tough to seize by force. So they're trying to do it through diplomacy. But that region, that string of cities where I was at the top of it, has really held the Russians back. And it's interesting when you drive through it, because it's open field from Kiev going forward through Kharkiv Oblast to Donetsk Oblast, at which point you're on quite elevated ground. You can see a lot of those fortifications, and you understand why it's been tough for Russia to break through. And conversely, if Russia were to acquire that, how it's a pretty easy path forward into more of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that's an interesting view from the ground. Kate, just to wrap up here today, what are you hearing about the state of Ukrainian resistance and the strength it has to outlast Russia here from your sources?
Well, look, we're coming into winter really quite quickly, which means that we do have kind of a fresh opportunity to infuse Ukraine with more weapons and different kinds of weapons that it could use jointly together. I think back to the offensive in 2023, where the Biden administration not really equipped Ukraine with enough stuff and trained them well enough to work together with those different types of equipment. And it was really a squandered opportunity. So look, I think Ukraine's manpower limitations, their air defense limitations are pretty well understood. Those are really urgent needs. But there's also now, since the war is clearly Putin is not interested in ending it, there is also an opportunity to get to use this opening to get Ukraine more leverage. I mean, the other day, Palmer Luckey, the tech founder, tweeted a picture of himself loading up a truck saying another of weapons, ostensibly a truck full of leverage for Ukraine is on its way. And I think that is a decent way of thinking about it, which is what I'm hoping, this pivot turns out to be substantive, because that battlefield picture, it is fragile. And eventually one side is going to break out. And Trump now has another window to try to change that picture.
All right, let's hope he listens to you, Kate. Thank you, Kate Odell. Thank you, Jillian Melter. And thank you all for listening here. We are on Potomac Watch every day, and we'd love to have your company tomorrow. Thanks for listening.